Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Joyce Tseng. A landmark piece of U.S. legislation was signed 45 years ago, setting a new precedent for Washington's ties with Taipei. It's called the Taiwan Relations Act, and it's come to define the close but unofficial relationship between the U.S. and Taiwan. Before we dive into the lasting impact of the legislation, let's first zoom out to understand why the U.S. needed a special law with Taiwan in the first place. Our reporter Jeremy Olivier has this report.
The end of an era and of a nearly four-decade post-war order in Asia. On December 15, 1978, then U.S. President Jimmy Carter announced that his country would break diplomatic ties with Taiwan, switching recognition to the People's Republic of China. The move was a long time coming. Taiwan had been expelled from the United Nations several years earlier, in 1971, with few recognizing its claim to be the legitimate government of all of China. And under Carter's predecessor, Richard Nixon, the U.S. began normalizing relations with Beijing. Still, the mood in Taipei was grim. People, angry with what they saw as a betrayal by the U.S., held increasingly violent anti-American protests. The government, under the lead of President Jiang Jingguo, tried to quell public outrage and chart a new course forward. Former diplomat Frederick Chien, Taiwan's deputy foreign minister at the time, was one of the top officials in charge of overseeing the American transition out of Taiwan. His task was to negotiate certain assurances.
Most importantly, security. Second, arms sale. Third, the property we have in the United States. And then we have air links and shipping. Will that be possible to continue, or that PRC might take over?
But Taiwan still had strong support from many on Capitol Hill. A group of Congress members, upset with Carter's switch to the PRC, worked to craft a piece of legislation that would come to define the U.S.-Taiwan relationship in the decades since. While behind the scenes, people on the ground in Taiwan were also hard at work making sure that the law would be strong enough to last. One of them was Robert Parker, who had just become chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan. Parker traveled from Taipei to Washington, D.C., to campaign for protecting not just U.S. business interests in Taiwan, but also the robust trade and investment ties the two countries had developed. Parker and others' testimony proved persuasive, and the bill that was signed into law on April 10, 1979, was much more powerful than President Carter or Beijing had anticipated. The Taiwan Relations Act calls for Taiwan to be treated the same as any other foreign country under U.S. laws, allows the U.S. to provide weapons for Taiwan's defense, directs the president to inform Congress of any threats to Taiwan's security, and establishes the American Institute in Taiwan, a nonprofit corporation that serves as Washington's de facto embassy in Taipei.
You can watch that full report on the TaiwanPlus website. As you've seen, the Taiwan Relations Act was a response to a changing geopolitical situation in East Asia, but many American companies also had to turn to it to figure out a way to keep doing business in Taiwan. To discuss this further, I spoke with Dan Silver, the current chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan. We start our discussion by zooming in on the role of the Taiwan Relations Act on American businesses here in Taiwan. Here's what Dan Silver had to say.
It plays a very serious and significant role. It is a framework, and it's a framework that exists in a space that without the TRA might have nothing. When derecognition occurred, there was not a go-to model for how the U.S.-Taiwan relationship would be structured. U.S. businesses, unlike the U.S. government, had continuity here in Taiwan. And they needed something to say that there would be both security and legal standing and continuity on all fronts to allow business to continue to prosper. And I think that the Taiwan Relations Act gave us that.
Can you describe a little bit about AmCham's role after the U.S. broke diplomatic ties with Taiwan? Because I would imagine it would AmCham can fill some of the gaps. And how has AmCham succeeded, I guess, in what it set out to do at that time?
Sure. So if we go back to the years before 1978, the US and Taiwan had an official diplomatic relationship with an embassy and with an ambassador. Leading up to derecognition in 1978, there was not a lot of discussion going on, not discussion between Washington and Taipei, and really not much discussion here in Taiwan about that eventuality. It was kind of an off-limits topic. So for that reason, when the announcement came about derecognition in December of 1978, it came in a way that appeared rather sudden. And most importantly, not a lot of planning had been done. There was a concept of something called the Taiwan Enabling Act, which would have established AIT, but left a lot of other things uncovered. And so it was not a complete sort of discussion about what the relationship between the United States and Taiwan would look like. And so the Chamber took on this role of kind of an intermediary. We went from a typical Chamber of Commerce representing business and maybe the interests of the community and social interests to one that became very much involved with advocacy. And since 1979, that role of advocacy has continued. And so in that period from December to April of 1979 into the finalization of the Taiwan Relations Act, the Chamber was playing an active role in helping move the US government from something that was really not well thought out. They called it the Taiwan Enabling Act. It wasn't the Relations Act. And the Chamber helped change that and gave guidance both in terms of legal status and contracts and trade and investment, but also in terms of just general security.
What would you say is central to that advocacy that you're describing, and how has it evolved throughout the years?
So evolved greatly. And if we think simply about the shared values that we have with Taiwan today, shared democratic values, probably couldn't have said that to the same extent in 1979 or even in the 1980s. Today we can. And so from that standpoint, the relationship has an even more firm footing than it did in the beginning. And I think that we've continued to build on this and work in terms of economic engagement, in terms of trade, in terms of helping the US government and others in Washington see Taiwan as a very important part of the US economic structure around the world. It is consistently a top 10 trading partner. It has been a top 10 trading partner for several decades. And I think it has been a place that has been a source of innovation and good collaboration with the United States as we move into new technologies.
Looking at some more recent trade milestones between the Taiwan and US, like the initiative on 21st century trade, what kind of role has AmCham played in that? And also, what is AmCham's most valuable function in maintaining this unofficial Taiwan-US ties?
We have multiple ways in which we gather and raise the voice of industry, so that when Washington, the US Trade Representative, others are thinking about what are the most important things that can be enshrined in something like a 21st century trade initiative agreement, we're there sharing our views, bringing up the ideas that we have for what needs to be done for the sake of better business, better investment, better trade. We do that in several ways. We do that through direct advocacy, meeting with those who are actually working on the negotiations, both in Taipei and in Washington. We also have an annual white paper. And so for our multiple industry committees, we take their views on what needs to be changed, what are the important things that Taiwan can do to make it an even better environment for doing business. And we put them into an annual white paper that we release every June. We're working on it now for 2024. That white paper is read by policymakers and by think tanks and others in Washington on a regular basis. Regulations are a part of the landscape in any market. And so a big part of what we do is asking for not only changes to specific regulations, but also changes in how regulations get done and how the voice of industry or the voice of the public can be heard in new and better ways through what we call good regulatory practice.
Mr. Silver, you've often mentioned a more urgent need for a bilateral trade agreement between Taiwan and the U.S. I'm Curious what the reception in Washington has been like. Can you describe this a little bit? And also, are you expecting that to change given it's an election year?
So the bilateral trade agreement is something that is at the top of our members' hopes for future engagement between the United States and Taiwan. So we advocate for it. It's been an agenda item for some years. We continue to push for it. In addition to the things I just mentioned, now that that COVID is more or less behind us and we can return to normal engagement, we're conducting physical door knocks in Washington, D.C. again, and that will also happen in June. This too is an annual event. We bring leaders of industry from Taiwan to Washington to have direct dialogue on Capitol Hill and with other decision makers. And so we're going to talk about the bilateral trade agreement because our members want to see that happen. But to your point, it's an election year. And we know that in election years, there's probably a lot less that gets done than in future years. But it's an opportunity because we have people who are thinking about leadership in the future after the election. What are the important things they must talk about, think about, get done? And the bilateral trade agreement will remain at the top of our agenda when we go and talk about this. The good news is that even if a bilateral trade agreement is still something that is a discussion point, and I think has bipartisan support, there are other things that are definitely happening this year. 21st Century Initiative on Trade is one of those things. The USTR in its March report to President Biden said that it was really at the top of their agenda for this year and trying to get the second half of that done.
Taiwan Relations Act. A lot of the things have stood the test of time. I'm also just curious though, in your opinion, has it evolved in its spirit in any way?
I think it has. I mean, I think that the macro environment is radically different than it was 45 years ago. It's evolved, as I've said earlier, because we're now working democracy to democracy. It's also evolved because the region has changed so much. So when we look across the strait and we ask ourselves, what was that like in 1979 versus what is it like in 2024, 45 years later? It's a vastly different situation. And I think we can give some real credit to the Taiwan Relations Act for standing that test of time and for being there to ensure stability and ensure that the region as a whole would have its focus on things like economic development, trade, investment. And that has worked. Taiwan Relations Act has served that purpose. It's helped to create that stability, and it's allowed for many, many people in this region to enjoy the fruits of a very new economic and even political situation. I think that we should look at the Taiwan Relations Act, 45 years of the Taiwan Relations Act, and say that it allowed for closer people-to-people engagement. It allowed for continued robust trade, investment. It allowed for the U.S. and Taiwan to navigate great changes both inside the United States and especially here in Taiwan, and to do that very successfully. So I think we should see the TRA in some ways as really a backbone, a foundation of the prosperity that not only Taiwan and the United States have enjoyed, but really what's allowed the region to prosper. It's brought stability, and it's brought the chance for like-minded people, like-minded institutions, governments to work together very closely and help thrive and prosper into the future.
That was Dan Silver, current chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan. And this has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, please visit our website and follow our social media. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for watching Taiwan Plus. For more stories from Taiwan and around the world, like Thailand's capital, please follow us on social media.